Hi, this is Blake.
Hi, this is Cameron. We welcome you to yet another episode of TrustTalks. All right, so today we're going deep. We're diving into the world of risk management. I think this is something that a lot of our listeners are thinking about.
Absolutely.
Who owns risk?
Yeah.
You know, it's a question that comes up a lot, and we really want to understand, like, who is this risk owner?
Right.
What do they actually do?
Yeah.
What skills do they need? And why should you care about all of this, even if you don't have that title risk owner on your business card?
Yeah, we're going to really try to, get beyond just the surface level and really understand this.
Exactly. And so to help us with this deep dive, we have a fantastic article from TrustCloud's GRC Launchpad. We always kind of think about executives, right? Like the folks at the top, they're the ones who are responsible for risk.
Right.
But what this deep dive reveals is that there's actually this whole network of risk owners all across an organization.
Yeah, it's fascinating how risk really is woven into every part of an organization. It's not just something that the C-suite deals with.
Exactly. So let's start with the basics. What exactly is a risk owner?
Well, the article defines a risk owner as someone who oversees a specific risk or set of risks, and they're accountable for understanding the potential impact of those risks. So, what could actually happen if this risk were to occur?
Okay, so it's more than just knowing about a risk, right? It's about having the responsibility to actually do something about it.
Absolutely.
That accountability piece really stands out to me.
Yeah, and that leads to the big decisions that they have to make. Like, do you try to prevent the risk? Do you try to transfer it? Or, is it something that you just accept if it's, within the organization's tolerance?
So they're like risk strategists in a way. They're weighing all these different options.
Exactly.
And speaking of strategy, our source lays out 7 key responsibilities of a risk owner.
Yes. And the first one is perhaps the most, fundamental: risk identification.
Right. You can't manage what you don't even know exists.
Exactly. So a risk owner needs to be constantly scanning, their area for potential threats, and just being aware of what's out there.
Right.
So let's say you're the IT security officer.
Right.
You're not just, checking your email. You're actively, on the hunt for vulnerabilities, new malware, anything that could put your systems at risk.
Right. So you're constantly threat hunting. You're being very proactive about it.
Yes.
You're not just waiting for something bad to happen.
Right. And once you've identified those risks, you move on to responsibility number 2, which is risk assessment.
Yeah.
And this is where you get into the, kind of the analytical side of things, figuring out, okay, how likely is each risk to actually happen and how severe would the impact be if it did happen?
So it's about understanding both the likelihood and the potential damage, right? Like a risk rating system, you might have a minor software glitch, right, that's easily fixed.
Right.
Versus a major data breach that could cripple the whole operation.
Absolutely.
So it's really about, kind of categorizing those and understanding the severity.
Exactly. And that brings us to responsibility number 3, which is risk mitigation.
Ooh. Now we're getting to the action.
Yeah, this is where the action starts. So the risk owner develops and implements strategies to either reduce the likelihood of the risk happening in the first place,
right,
or to, soften the blow if it does happen.
So sticking with that data breach example, right, what are some ways that a risk owner might actually mitigate that risk?
So they could implement, stronger cybersecurity measures like multi-factor authentication to make it harder for, hackers to get in.
Right.
They could focus on employee training, right, to reduce the chance of human error.
Smart.
There's a whole range of things they can do.
So they're thinking about prevention, right? Like, how do we prevent this bad thing from happening? But what if, despite their best efforts, a breach still happens?
Right.
Like, what then?
Well, that's where having, things like cyber insurance comes in.
Right.
It's a way to transfer some of that financial risk.
Right. So they're kind of covering all the bases, right?
Exactly.
But I imagine the risk owner doesn't just, set these plans in motion and then just walk away, right?
You're absolutely right. That's where responsibilities 4 and 5 come in, which are monitoring and reporting, and then, decision-making based on what they're seeing.
Okay.
So the risk owner keeps a close eye on how things evolve. They track any changes and they report their findings to the relevant people, including, senior management.
So it's like being a a risk detective in a way. They're constantly gathering clues and looking for patterns, trying to understand, how are things changing? What new information do we have?
Exactly. So let's say you're responsible for, supply chain disruptions.
Okay.
You would be constantly monitoring things like, geopolitical events, natural disasters, or even, shifts in consumer demand.
Mm-hmm.
Anything that could, interrupt that flow of goods.
Right.
And then based on what you're seeing, you have to make those tough decisions.
Yeah.
Right? Do you need to find new suppliers? Do you need to, stockpile inventory?
Right. So you're not just gathering information, you're actually, using that information to make decisions.
Exactly. And that's the risk owner's job. It's making those judgment calls to, keep things running smoothly.
So we're seeing it's not just about being analytical, right? It's about leadership and strategy too.
Absolutely.
And there are two more responsibilities, right? We've got communication and documentation.
That's right.
Because, even the best risk mitigation plan is useless if no one knows about it.
Exactly. So risk owners need to be, clear and concise in communicating information to everyone who's involved. And they need to keep, meticulous records of everything they do. It's like having a risk management diary.
Right.
So if something does go wrong, you can demonstrate, hey, these are the steps I took.
Right. I did my due diligence.
Exactly.
Now, this has all been super insightful, but I want to bring it back to you, the listener, for a second. Even if risk owner isn't in your job title, think about how these responsibilities apply to your work, right?
Yeah.
What are the risks that you encounter every day?
Right.
And what steps could you take to manage them?
That's an important question for everyone to consider, really.
Absolutely. And speaking of important questions, our source also digs into the skills and qualifications of a successful risk owner.
So we've laid the groundwork. We kind of understand what a risk owner is, the responsibilities.
Right.
Now let's explore a little bit what makes a great risk owner.
Okay.
And the article, again, from TrustCloud's GRC Launchpad, they highlight some key skills qualifications.
Let's dive into those a bit. What really stands out to you in terms of the skills?
Well, accountability is absolutely crucial.
Okay.
A risk owner needs to be comfortable taking ownership even when things go wrong.
Right.
It's not about pointing fingers. It's about stepping up and saying, I'm responsible and I'm going to address this.
Right. That makes sense. If you're going to be the one making those tough calls, you got to be able to, handle the consequences.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And to make those informed decisions, you need strong analytical skills.
Okay.
Risk assessment involves understanding complex data, spotting patterns, connecting the dots.
It's like being a detective, but instead of solving crimes, you're solving for potential risks.
Exactly. You have to break down those complex problems into manageable pieces. Assess the likelihood and potential impact of each risk.
Right.
And then develop strategies to address them.
So you need that analytical mind, but you also need to be decisive, right? There's no room for hesitation when it comes to risk mitigation.
Right. A good risk owner can weigh the options, assess the potential outcomes, and make the call, even under pressure.
Even under pressure.
Yeah.
And once they've made that decision, they got to be able to communicate it effectively.
Absolutely. Communication is key. They'll often be talking to people who may not be risk management experts, so they need to be able to explain these complex concepts
right,
clearly and concisely, whether they're presenting to the CEO
right,
or working with a team of engineers.
So tailoring that message to the audience,
Yeah.
making sure everyone understands the risk in the plan.
Exactly. And they also need to be skilled collaborators.
Okay.
Risk management is rarely a solo mission.
Right.
It often involves working across departments, getting everyone on board, aligned on the approach.
It's interesting, all these skills, accountability, analytical thinking, decision-making, communication, collaboration, all these things come together to create, a successful risk owner.
Absolutely.
But what about formal qualifications?
Right.
Like, does a risk owner need a specific degree or certification?
Well, the answer, as with many things in risk management, is it depends.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course. Nothing is ever black and white.
Exactly. The article highlights a few common qualifications. A degree in a related field, like risk management, finance, or even engineering, can be valuable, but it's not always essential.
Okay. I can see how practical experience would be incredibly valuable. Like having been in the trenches, facing real world risks, learning how to handle them.
Absolutely. That hands-on experience can be even more important than a degree because it shows you've dealt with those high-pressure situations and come out on top.
Right. What about certifications? Those seem to be increasingly popular these days.
Yeah, they can definitely add, credibility to your profile. The article mentions a few, like the Certified Risk Manager, CRM, Certified Information Auditor, CSF, or the Certified in Risk and Information Systems Control, CRISC.
These all sound very impressive. I imagine the specific certifications that are most valuable kind of depends on the industry.
Right.
And the type of risk involved.
You're exactly right. It's all about aligning your credentials with your area of expertise.
Okay.
So if you're in IT security, cybersecurity certifications make sense.
Right.
If you're in finance, financial risk management certifications would be more relevant.
So tailoring those qualifications to the specific risks that you're likely to encounter.
Precisely. Now let's move on to a really interesting part. Who are these risk owners out in the real world?
Right. We've talked about the what, the how. Now I want to know the who.
Well, our source provides a fascinating breakdown of different roles within an organization and the types of risks they might own.
Okay, let's start at the top. What about executive leadership? Like what kind of risks are keeping the CEO up at night?
They're the ones setting the overall risk appetite for the organization.
Okay.
So think about the big picture risks, like strategic risks, reputational risks, even geopolitical risks.
So we're talking about like economic downturns, disruptive technologies,
right?
Maybe even like global pandemics.
Absolutely.
These are massive, like organizational level risks.
Right. And they have to think long term, about the viability of the entire organization in the face of these massive unknowns. But risk ownership doesn't just stop there. It cascades down throughout the organization.
So while the CEO is grappling with these these huge big picture challenges, you have other individuals who are dealing with much more focused but equally crucial risks.
Exactly. So for instance, the IT security officer, with data breaches constantly making headlines, this role is more vital than ever.
Yeah, that seems like a high pressure job with a lot of responsibility riding on their shoulders.
Absolutely. They're responsible for protecting the organization's sensitive data. They're implementing those cybersecurity measures we talked about earlier. They're monitoring for threats, and they're ready to respond if an incident occurs. One wrong move and hackers could be running rampant through the system.
Right. And speaking of high pressure jobs, what about the compliance officer? It seems like they're always, wading through regulations, paperwork.
They are. Their role is all about ensuring the organization is adhering to all applicable laws, regulations, and internal policies.
Okay.
So they're constantly managing compliance risks, conducting audits, staying on top of that ever-changing regulatory landscape.
Yeah, sounds like a job that requires incredible attention to detail and a love of staying organized.
It definitely does. But our source doesn't just focus on those high-level roles. It also highlights risk owners in other departments like finance, HR, even product development.
So risk ownership is really woven into the fabric of the entire organization.
It is, and that's why understanding these principles of risk ownership is so important no matter what your role is. We all play a part in managing risk, whether we realize it or not.
Yeah, it's a powerful realization. But before we wrap up, our source leaves us with a final thought-provoking question. So we've talked about who risk owners are, what they do, the skills they need, but now we're getting to the really interesting part.
Right. We've been focusing so much on, internal risk owners. But what about the risks that come from outside the organization? The things that even the most diligent risk owner can't fully control.
The wild cards, the things that keep you up at night, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about things like, sudden economic downturns, political upheavals, natural disasters, maybe even like a massive shift in consumer behavior that just comes out of nowhere.
Right, exactly.
Forces that are completely outside of anyone's control.
Yeah.
So then the question becomes, who owns those risks? Like, how do you even manage something that you can't plan for, that you can't necessarily assign to a specific person or a department?
That's a tough one. I mean, it's almost like, trying to hold back the tide. You can't control these external forces, but you can try to build what we call organizational resilience.
Okay. So it's less about assigning responsibility to one person and more about creating systems and processes that can kind of weather those unexpected storms.
Precisely. So think about like scenario planning, right?
Yeah.
Where you imagine different potential futures, some good, some bad. And you kind of game out how you would respond in each of those scenarios.
You're not just like reacting to what's happening in the moment. You're trying to anticipate what could happen and kind of, plan for those different possibilities.
Exactly. And it also involves, things like diversifying your operations.
Okay.
So you're not overly reliant on any one supplier or market or even geographic location. It's about spreading that risk.
Don't put all your eggs in one basket, as they say.
Exactly. And it's also about constantly monitoring that external environment, staying informed about, emerging trends and potential disruptions. It's like having a risk radar that's always scanning the horizon.
Right. Always looking out for those blips on the radar that could, signal trouble ahead. And I imagine communication plays a big role here, too.
Absolutely, yeah. It's about fostering a culture of risk awareness throughout the organization, making sure that everyone from the CEO down to the newest employee understands that, risk is just part of doing business in a complex world.
So having those open lines of communication, making sure everyone is kind of aware of what those potential external risks are and how they might impact, the business.
Right. Because no one can be an expert in everything.
Right.
So it's about sharing information, working together.
Now, listener, we want to bring this back to you. Even if you don't have risk owner in your, official job title, you can still apply these principles of risk ownership to your own work, to your own life.
Yeah, absolutely. Think about it this way. Ask yourself, what are the potential risks, both internal and external, that could impact my work? What steps can I take to mitigate those risks? Who do I need to loop in to make sure we're all on the same page?
I love that. It's about being proactive, not reactive, not waiting for something to go wrong before you take action.
Exactly. We may not be able to control every risk that comes our way, but by being aware, prepared, proactive, we can certainly navigate those uncertainties much more effectively.
This has been such an insightful deep dive. We've gone from the basic definition of a risk owner all the way to, exploring these complex external forces that can impact an entire organization. It's really, shifted my perspective on how I think about risk.
Yeah. And I think this is the final thought. Remember that the world of risk is constantly evolving.
Right.
New risks are emerging all the time, so it's important to stay curious, stay informed, and, always be one step ahead.
Great point to end on. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into risk ownership. And until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those risk radars on high alert.